Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the shadows of history to uncover the chilling origins of a legend. Forget the capes and fangs you think you know. We're talking about the real man, the brutal truth, and the birth of Vlad the Impaler. Picture this: the silent, heavy air of Wallachia, a land caught between empires. No wind, no birds, just the creak of rope as a boy watches his own father, Vlad II Dracul, a knight of the Order of the Dragon, unjustly executed. This wasn't some distant battlefield. It was a betrayal by his own people, the boyars, the very nobles his father swore to protect. This boy, Vlad, and his younger brother Radu had already been hostages to the Ottoman Empire, taken across the Danube, into a gilded cage where they learned the harsh realities of power, the discipline of the Janissaries, and that mercy was a rare commodity. Vlad watched, he learned, but he didn't bow. He saw how obedience was forged through pain, how authority was written in blood. While Radu charmed his captors, Vlad's silence was a storm brewing. When news of his father's and elder brother Mircha's gruesome end reached him, something fundamentally shifted. He was 15, and he saw betrayal not as a mistake, but as an open wound demanding a response. Years later, released from captivity, he returned to a Wallachia that was a ruin. His father's dragon standard trampled, his people suffering, and those same treacherous boyars feasting on the spoils. He rode into Targoviste, a ghost from the past, eyes as sharp as a sword. At first, he moved cautiously, seeking alliances, offering forgiveness. But they mistook his restraint for weakness, whispering that he was broken. They were so wrong. Vlad had returned with a purpose sharpened by years of captivity and the burning memory of his family's fate. If mercy couldn't unite his kingdom, terror would. The stage was set. He summoned the boyars to a grand feast, a deceptive calm before the storm. They ate, they drank, they boasted. Then, with the meal finished, Vlad's soft questions about their loyalty turned into an icy reckoning. One by one, they were led not to their beds, but to the courtyard, where stakes stood stark against the pale moonlight. The next morning, a chilling silence hung over Wallachia. The people spoke his name with a new mix of reverence and terror. Vlad Draculea, the son of the dragon, had returned. He ruled not from a throne of velvet, but from the certainty that loyalty couldn't be bought. It had to be enforced. He had learned from his captors that terror could shape empires, and now he would wield that lesson against anyone who dared forget his name. He saw Wallachia not as a kingdom to inherit, but as a deep wound to cauterize, and his chosen medicine was justice drawn in red. This was the dawn of a legend, the beginning of Vlad the Impaler, the man who turned cruelty into law and law into legend. What do you think about Vlad's grim journey? Was his terror a necessary evil to protect his people, or simply a descent into madness? Let us know in the comments below. That year, winter came to Wallachia like a judgment. The forests froze, the rivers hardened to glass, and the smoke from distant villages hung in the air like a warning. It was 1456, and Vlad III had reclaimed his throne. His rule began not with a grand ceremony, but with the whisper of blades in the dark. He had learned from his father's mistakes and from the discipline of his Ottoman captors. Mercy, he now believed, was simply the seed of rebellion. He looked upon his kingdom and saw only decay. The nobles were fat with greed, the merchants corrupted by foreign gold, and the peasants crushed beneath both. The old order had traded its honor for convenience. Vlad's gaze, sharp and unrelenting, saw only rot. And rot, he decided, could not be reasoned with. It had to be cut out. He vowed that Wallachia would no longer be the trembling ground between two empires. It would become an iron wall, ruled not by compromise, but by absolute, unwavering fear. The first to learn this lesson were the boyars, the powerful nobles who had survived his father's downfall. Vlad summoned them to his court, speaking of renewal and unity. They arrived dressed in silks and deceit, certain the young prince sought reconciliation. They drank his wine, toasted his rule, and bowed with the grace of practiced liars. But at dawn, their deception ended. The doors were barred, and the hall filled with the sound of chains. Vlad's voice didn't rise in anger. It remained calm, deliberate, as he condemned them for treason and hypocrisy. When the sun broke the horizon, the city's gates opened not to freedom, but to a forest of sharpened stakes. They say the impalement was slow, methodical, almost ritualistic. The condemned were lifted onto the stakes so carefully that death arrived only after long, agonizing hours. Smoke from burning tar filled the air, mingling with the last prayers of the dying. Vlad watched it all from a balcony, motionless, his face pale against the rising sun. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was restoration. The land had to see what justice looked like when it no longer trembled. For weeks, the roads leading to his capital, Targoviste, were lined with corpses. It became known as the Forest of Stakes. Travelers rode faster, their eyes averted. Soldiers began to salute the dead, as if they were sentinels of a new order. Even the wind seemed to move differently there. When foreign envoys passed through, they carried terrifying tales back to their kings. Tales of a prince who ruled through terror and precision, who believed fear was far more enduring than love. And yet beneath the horror, a strange kind of peace settled over the land. Crime vanished. The roads, once thick with thieves and mercenaries, became so safe that merchants could travel unguarded. Peasants began to harvest their fields again without fear of bandits or crushing boyar taxes. Vlad imposed order with a merciless fairness. No theft, no deceit, no treachery. When a merchant complained that his goods had been stolen, Vlad ordered the thief hunted down and impaled by sunrise. Then he returned the stolen items with his own seal of apology. "Let no man doubt justice," he is said to have declared. His rule, though brutal, began to heal what politics had shattered. But peace built on fear cannot sleep for long. The Ottoman Empire, vast and relentless, demanded tribute. For years, Wallachia had paid gold and loyalty to the Sultan in exchange for survival. Vlad refused both. To pay was to kneel, and he had already spent too many years on his knees as a hostage in the Ottoman court. When the Sultan's envoys arrived demanding payment, they arrogantly refused to remove their turbans before him, as custom required. In response, Vlad ordered their turbans nailed to their skulls, so they might never forget their insolence. "A man should keep his head covered," he reportedly told them as they were dragged away. The message was unmistakable. Word of this insult reached Constantinople swiftly. The Sultan, Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, ruler of half the known world, did not take such defiance lightly. But Vlad had anticipated his fury. He began fortifying his castles, drilling his soldiers, and cleansing his borders of spies. He sent warnings to neighboring kingdoms, pleading for a united front, but none offered aid. Fear, it seemed, isolates even when it protects. Inside his own walls, Vlad's isolation deepened. Those who served him began to worship and dread him in equal measure. His court fell silent whenever he entered a room. Even his own brother Radu, once the gentle counterpart to Vlad's iron resolve, had long since turned to the Ottomans, now serving under Mehmed's banner. Their bloodline, once united by exile, was now divided by loyalty. Vlad ruled alone, haunted by the shadows of his family's betrayal and the echo of his own brutal methods. Each night, he would walk the ramparts of his fortress at Poenari, overlooking the Argesh River. The moonlight would glint off the stakes below, pale as bone in the frost. The wind carried the faint creak of wood, the only sound in a kingdom disciplined by terror. To outsiders, he was a monster. To himself, a guardian. "Better 1,000 impaled than one nation enslaved," he once declared. Whether those words were a justification or a confession, no one can say. The people feared him, yet they obeyed. The nobles hated him, yet they served. In his cruelty, there was no madness, only cold, calculating intent. He built a nation that would not bow, and in doing so, he made himself into its instrument. Wallachia became his mirror, cold, proud, and unyielding. But fear, once unleashed, is a tide that spares no one. The more Vlad imposed order, the more the world beyond his borders conspired to undo him. The Hungarian king watched with unease. Ottoman scouts gathered beyond the Danube, their eyes fixed on the Black Mountains. Rumors grew that Mehmed himself would soon march north. The forest of stakes that had once frightened invaders was now seen as a challenge. A man who rules by terror, they whispered, must one day face it himself. Still, Vlad did not waver. His council begged for caution, for diplomacy, but he had buried too many fathers and brothers to believe in compromise. He looked to the horizon and saw not an empire approaching, but a test. The Ottomans had taught him the language of fear. Now, he would speak it back to them in their own tongue. As snow began to fall again over Targoviste, the stakes stood like frozen sentinels, marking the border between order and chaos. The smell of ash clung to the air, and the fires of judgment burned low but steady. Vlad sat alone in his chamber, his father's dragon seal beside him, the flicker of candlelight reflected in his eyes. He had remade Wallachia in his image, disciplined, unflinching, and unforgiving. Yet in the silence of that room, something deeper stirred, a realization that even iron cracks when struck long enough. Beyond the river, the first Ottoman banners were already rising, and captivating than any fictional horror you've ever encountered. We're talking about a figure whose name still echoes through history, inspiring tales of terror and legendary monsters. Forget what you think you know about Dracula, because the real man behind the myth was far more brutal, brilliant, and utterly terrifying. Picture this. The year is 1462, the air above the Danube River, thick with the smell of wood smoke and a growing sense of dread. To the south, the colossal Ottoman Empire, a sleeping giant, was finally stirring. And who had poked this slumbering beast? None other than Vlad Tepes, the Prince of Wallachia. Mehmed II, the Sultan who'd conquered Constantinople and crushed entire kingdoms, had turned his formidable gaze towards Vlad's small, defiant land. For years, Vlad had refused to pay tribute, and his defiance had become an insult too grand for an emperor to ignore. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was personal. Winter's thaw revealed the grim shape of war. From the hills above the Argesh River, Vlad watched what he could only describe as a black tide gather. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers, their horses, and their elaborate banners moved across the landscape like a single, terrifying organism. Drums echoed across the plains, slow and patient, each beat a chilling promise of retribution. And if that wasn't enough, his scouts brought back an even more crushing piece of news. His own brother, Radu, a boy who'd once been his companion in captivity, was now marching under the Sultan's flag. Blood would literally face blood. The might of an empire would face a single man who had learned far too much from its cruelty. Vlad's forces were, to put it mildly, minuscule, a mere fraction of Mehmed's overwhelming numbers. But what he lacked in soldiers, he made up for in an intimate, almost primal knowledge of his homeland. He knew the forests, the mountains, the winding rivers. Every ravine, every bend in the Argesh was not just a landmark, but a potential weapon. He issued chilling orders: empty the villages, burn the fields, poison every well. He left nothing for the invaders but ash and silence. His people, hardened by years of his rule, obeyed without question. They had learned long ago that disobedience carried its own swift and brutal death. And so, the very land became an accomplice to his vengeance, cold, hungry, and merciless. At night, the fires of the Ottoman encampment flickered across the river like a sea of stars spread across the earth. But within those star fields, Vlad's soldiers moved like ghosts. They wore the colors of the dead, the scent of the soil, and they struck with the sudden icy force of a phantom wind. The war he waged was not one of conventional armies. It was a war of psychological terror. Captured Ottoman soldiers simply vanished without a trace, only to be found days later, impaled along the roads leading back to the Danube. The Sultan's generals, hardened men of war, began to whisper that Wallachia was cursed, that the very trees watched their every move. The psychological toll was immense. Then, on a moonless night in June, Vlad launched his most audacious, perhaps his most insane attack. The chronicles would forever remember it as the night assault at Târgoviște. He gathered his men in absolute silence, their armor blackened with soot to blend into the darkness, their torches extinguished. The only sounds were the soft breath of horses and the faint creak of leather. They crossed the river under the thick shroud of night, led by the prince himself. His plan was madness itself, yet executed with chilling method. Strike deep into the very heart of Mehmed's camp, find the Sultan's tent, and sever the serpent's head. What followed was pure chaos, carved in flame. The Wallachians swept through the Ottoman camp like a living storm. Arrows hissed through the darkness, tents collapsed under the weight of attacking soldiers, and men screamed prayers in every language known to the vast empire. Fire spread rapidly, devouring canvas and flesh alike. The Turks, caught completely off guard, believed the dead had risen, that Vlad had somehow called upon the devil himself. Through the smoke and confusion, his soldiers cried out his name, not as a man, but as a guttural curse. Miraculously, Mehmed escaped, saved by sheer fortune and the utter pandemonium. When dawn finally broke, the camp was a graveyard. Thousands lay dead, and the Danube ran red with blood for miles. But victory for Vlad was never a clean affair. His own losses were immense, a grim testament to the ferocity of the attack. The war he had begun was far from over, despite the tactical success. Mehmed, though visibly shaken, was not broken. His vast army advanced further into the heart of Wallachia. But now they moved with extreme caution. They had seen a glimpse of true horror. And what they found next near Târgoviște defied all logic of warfare, turning even the most hardened soldiers pale. Before them stood a forest of the dead, an estimated 20,000 corpses impaled upon towering stakes, stretching for miles in every direction. Soldiers, prisoners, peasants, all displayed in grim, horrifying perfection. The wind hummed a low, mournful tune through their hollowed bodies. Ravens, heavy with feasting, circled ominously overhead. The chroniclers say Mehmed himself dismounted, gazed upon this unspeakable sight, and then, without a word, turned away. What can be taken from a man who has made death his kingdom? He is said to have murmured. The invasion faltered. The Sultan, unnerved and disgusted, withdrew his forces. But the horror he had witnessed would live on, retold in courts and taverns across Europe. The name Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, would travel faster than his armies ever could. He had won, but at what cost? Even victory, especially one built on such terror, carries its own decay. The very fear that had driven his enemies away began to corrode the foundation of his own rule. His people, utterly exhausted by endless blood and famine, began to fear him even more than they feared the Ottomans. The Wallachian nobles he had spared now quietly plotted against him. The foreign allies he had desperately sought turned cold, repulsed by his reputation. And in the shadows of Transylvania, a familiar betrayal began to take shape. The Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, once Vlad's staunch ally, saw in Vlad's unparalleled cruelty a convenient pretext. Letters were forged, accusing Vlad of treacherous dealings with the very Ottomans he had so fiercely fought. The man who had defended Christendom with unrelenting zeal was now painted as their secret friend. When Matthias's envoys arrived, they came not with aid, but with chains. Vlad, believing he was meeting to discuss battle strategy, walked directly into his own arrest. He was led through the very forests he once ruled, past the rivers where he had watched empires drown, and into a Hungarian dungeon. For 12 long years, he would rot there, neither prince nor true prisoner, forgotten by those who had once called him savior. In his cell, the grim stories say he kept a small cage of mice. He would feed them crumbs, then, with chilling precision, impale them on tiny splinters. Perhaps it was madness, a slow descent into utter despair. Or perhaps it was a ritual, a macabre reminder of who he was, or of what he had become. Outside his cell, Europe moved on. Mehmed continued to expand his empire. Radu, his brother, ruled Wallachia under Ottoman favor, spreading a fragile peace where Vlad had planted absolute fear. The world that had shaped Vlad no longer remembered him as a protector, only as a monster. And yet, even in his long absence, his legend grew. Pamphlets printed in Germany told sensationalized tales of a prince who drank blood and feasted among corpses. Letters from terrified merchants spoke of walls built of bodies, of ghastly feasts of impalement. Some called him the son of the devil. Others, God's fearsome punishment upon sinners. The truth, already blurred by his actions, dissolved completely beneath the weight of myth. Vlad Tepes had become more than a man. He had become a chilling warning. When he was finally released, the world outside had changed irrevocably. But the silence that followed his imprisonment did not feel like peace. It felt like the ominous pause before a storm returns. The dragon's son still lived, and the land still whispered his name. All right, settle in, because tonight we're diving deep into a tale of survival, defiance, and a spark of hope that ignites in the darkest of nights. Imagine this. The desert night has swallowed everything whole, except for the distant flicker of a campfire and the soft, unsettling crunch of boots on sand. You're huddled close with others, under a tattered piece of sailcloth, your wrists raw from ropes, but your spirit, that's burning hotter than any flame. This is Elara's story. She's one of the prisoners, and Captain Graves's chilling offer still echoes in her mind. Serve him and live, or defy him and watch everyone you care about die. Through the firelight she can see him, a towering silhouette against the flames, talking in low, precise tones to his first mate, Reddick. There's an undeniable control about Graves, an aura that just chokes the very air around him. It's heavy, oppressive. Beside her, a young woman named Nia trembles. "He'll kill us," she whispers, fear thick in her voice. "He'll kill us all before sunrise." But Elara. She turns, forcing a calm she doesn't entirely feel into her voice. "Not if I can help it." She's been studying those ropes, you see, for what feels like an eternity. Tight, yes, but hastily tied. The kind of work done when you're strong but careless. Graves men, mercenaries, reckless. And reckless men, my friends, they always make mistakes. Suddenly, Reddick approaches, a torch held high. His face is half lit, casting him in an eerie glow. "Captain says you've until dawn to make your choice," he sneers, his eyes sweeping over them like a predator. "You fight for him, or you're buried where you sit." He throws a water skin at them, and it lands with a dull thud. The others lunge for it, desperate for a sip of life. But Elara? She stays perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Graves's silhouette. No, not yet. She wasn't ready to yield. Not ever. Once Reddick leaves, Elara leans closer to Nia, her voice barely a whisper. "Listen to me. When the guards change at midnight, I'll make my move." Nia's eyes widen, filled with terror and disbelief. "You can't. They'll what?" Elara's whisper sharpens, cutting through the fear. "They already took our ship, our crew, our freedom. What more is there to lose?" The words hang heavy in the smoke-filled air. Around them, some prisoners pray, others stare blankly, their hope completely drained. But a few, just a few, watch Elara. And in their eyes there's a flicker, a tiny spark of defiance. Midnight. The moon is at its highest point, casting a silver sheen over the camp. Drunken laughter has faded into snores. The guards at the perimeter change shifts, their boots crunching softly in the sand. Elara waits until the last footsteps fade into the darkness. Then she moves. She twists her wrists, the coarse rope grinding against her skin, each fiber burning. Pain lances up her arms, but she doesn't stop. Years at sea have taught her patience, precision, survival. Instinct takes over. One thread at a time, the rope loosens until finally it gives. Nia gasps softly as Elara frees her hands. How? Quiet, Elara hisses, immediately untying Nia, then moving to the others. She works quickly, silently, freeing one person, then another. But just as she reaches the last man, a scarred deckhand named Rowan, a sound freezes her blood. A crunch, a footstep. She turns sharply, her eyes catching a faint glint of steel. Reddick stands there, his sneer illuminated by the torchlight. "Thought you were clever, did you?" Elara's heart hammers in her chest. For one agonizing breath, the camp is silent again. Then, she lunges. She drives her shoulder into Reddick's gut, knocking the torch from his hand. Firelight scatters, embers dancing on the sand. Reddick grunts, slashing wildly with his blade as Elara ducks beneath his arm. The camp erupts. Shouts ring out. The other prisoners scramble to their feet, fear turning into a desperate urge to run. "Run!" Elara yells, her voice raw. "Now!" Chaos explodes. Prisoners surge into the night, scattering toward the dunes, towards anything that isn't here. Reddick, recovering, grabs Elara by the arm, twisting her hard. The cold edge of his blade kisses her throat. And then, a crack. Someone, maybe Rowan, maybe another, swings a rock. It connects with Reddick's skull. He drops like an anchor. Elara stumbles back, gasping, her pulse thundering in her ears. Nia grabs her hand. "Come on!" They run. The sand burns beneath their feet, the wind cutting cold against their faces. Behind them, the camp is a cacophony of shouts. Graves's voice rises above it all, sharp and commanding. "Find them! Bring me the girl alive!" Elara doesn't look back. Every step is survival. Every breath is rebellion. They reach the ridge, overlooking the coast. Below them, the shattered remains of their ship lie half buried in the tide. Smoke from the wreck still coils into the air like a dying serpent, a haunting reminder of what they'd lost. Nia falls to her knees, sobbing. "We'll never make it." Elara turns to her, her eyes fierce in the moonlight. "We will, but we can't go back, not until he's stopped." Around her, the others gather, 5, maybe 6 who managed to escape, tired, wounded, but alive. They look at her, not as a prisoner, but as something more, a leader. She scans the horizon, the dark line of the ocean stretching endlessly before them. Somewhere out there, freedom waited, but between them and that freedom stood Captain Graves, cold, ruthless, and relentless. The night air is thick with salt and promise. Elara clenches her fists, feeling the sting of her raw wrists. "He took our ship," she says softly, her voice filled with a quiet, dangerous resolve. "Now we take everything from him." And as the wind howls across the dunes, carrying the distant echo of pursuit, Elara turns toward the darkness, ready for whatever comes next. The fight has just begun. What an incredible story, right? That sense of determination, that refusal to give up when all hope seems lost. It's what makes us human. If you loved this tale of defiance and courage, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more epic adventures. Let me know in the comments what you think Elara will do next. Thanks for watching.